I've been talking about it for long enough. It's time to tackle sourdough. To see if we can take this, and make this. I pride myself on being a baker that can pretty much turn his hand to anything that includes flour, but until recently, sourdough has been my utter nemesis. But thankfully, I decided at the start of the year that this year was going to be the year that I tackle sourdough, so I've spent a lot of time, a lot of flour trying to overcome those woes, and I'm very happy to say that now I'm regularly turning out loaves of bread that I'm super happy with and that I'm proud to say that I made. So today, finally, I'm going to show you how to do it, and hopefully you'll avoid the pitfalls that I've been doing for the last few years. So first things first, the starter. Think of the starter as a more flavoursome, more complex version of this, packet yeast. Commercial yeast is just that, a single strand of yeast, nothing more. Sourdough, on the other hand, is natural yeast plus bacteria, which is what is going to give our bread its unique flavour. Now, to make the starter, we only need to dedicate a whopping 5 minutes every day for 7 days. So to make our starter, we only need a very few small things. We need a jar with a lid. We need a scale, and this is an absolute must. We need a small spatula, obviously our water and flour, and then we also need a digital thermometer. So the reason we're going to use a thermometer is to keep our water temperature consistent. I like to use water that's about 26 degrees Celsius, and that means that in my house the starter will double in size in about 8 to 10 hours. Now obviously if you live in a hotter climate you can cool the water slightly, and the vice versa is true. If you're in a colder climate, you can raise the water temperature a little bit. Now, this becomes more important when we're talking about baking a loaf of bread and our proofing times, but we'll talk about that in the actual sourdough bread recipe video that's coming out in a few weeks. Let's talk flour for a second. Now, when you're creating your starter, you can obviously use regular white flour. That'll be absolutely fine. You could also use wholemeal or even rye or even spelt. Actually, there's a whole range of flours you can use to create your starter. My preference is to use a mix of regular white bread flour and then wholemeal bread flour, simply because it's a really good basis for lots of different styles of recipes, and since I only have one starter, it's just a really good place to start. I also really like to use organic flours for this, simply because there's more of the natural yeast and bacteria, which means we'll get a more active starter more quickly. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is add our water, so 50 mils. And then we're going to add an equal weight of our flour, and this is our equal mix of wholemeal and regular flour. So just add that in. So just mix that together until there are no pockets of flour, until everything is nicely hydrated, and then that is it for day one. Finally, just add the lid onto the jar, but don't screw it tight, just leave it nice and loose so that the starter can breathe, and then we'll feed it again tomorrow. Oh, and also don't forget to give your starter a name. If you treat it more like a pet, then hopefully you're less likely to kill it, because hopefully you don't kill your pets. So, what should I call mine? We want to keep the starter out of the heat and out of the light, so pop it in a dark spot for 24 hours. Okay, so it's day 2. We've let the starter sit for 24 hours. Now, not much may have happened. The smell of the starter isn't much different. It smells very much like raw flour. There's no real yeasty flavors, no kind of lactic smell, nothing acidic, but you may see a possible bubble or two on the surface. If not, that's totally fine. So all we're gonna do now is add another 50 grams of our flour mix and 50 mils of water. Stir it again, then we're just gonna set it aside for another day. Also, you guys came up with an amazing name for my starter. You sent me hundreds of ideas on Instagram, but my favorite was Goldie Hawn, so that's what I'm gonna call it. So by day 3, our starter has had some significant development and we can see a lot of bubbles. Now, don't be thinking that this means we can bake with it. Starters need to have a bit of time before they stabilize and they're ready to be baked with. Just because there's bubbles doesn't mean there's enough yeast and bacteria in there to help sustain a loaf of bread. And also you'll notice that it's not really rising and falling yet, it's just bubbling. So what we're going to do this time is we're going to remove all but 25 grams of the starter and then feed it again with 50 grams of our flour mix and 50 mils of water. Also, don't worry too much if, whilst you're making the starter, that for the first week or so, it goes through a different few phases of smells. Sometimes it can be a little unpleasant, especially in the first few days, but as it stabilizes, the bacteria cultures in there will kind of settle almost, or stabilize, and you'll get a much more pleasing smell. Don't worry too much if it's a bit pongy to start with. Now, this stuff we've just poured off, this is what's known as the discard, and normally it's thought of as wastage. And you guys asked if there's ways to use less flour, to not feed it every day, to prevent lots and lots of waste. Now, the good news is the discard can be baked with, and I'm going to show you how to do that in the last episode of this series. But just to note right now, whilst we're still creating the starter, whilst it's still young, I personally don't like to bake with it, purely because it can have off flavors, so at this time you do need to discard it. But once the starter is created, there are a couple of things we can do. We can slow down the starter in the fridge, and we can bake with it. I'll talk more about both of those later. It's day 4, and wait, is it? I'm losing track. I think it's day 4. Anyway, it's day 4, and the starter is starting to show some really beautiful activity. It's not quite doubling, but it is increasing a little bit in volume, and we're getting lots of nice fermentation bubbles in the starter. So what we're going to do today is slightly different. This morning we're going to feed it as normal, and then tonight we're going to feed it a second time. And this is just going to really start to advance the starter, get it really going, because it's really hungry at the moment. So we're going to feed it twice a day now until it's starting to double as we like. So now that it's all fed, we will see it later tonight. So now that the starter has sat for a day, we can see that it's rising really nicely, almost doubling in size. And now it is really healthy and it is growing every time we feed it. We want to keep a track of how much it's growing, because we want it to kind of double in size, because that gives us an indication it's strong enough to bake with. So there are a couple ways of doing it. You can pop a rubber band at the starting level when you've fed the starter at its lowest point, and then see how much more it rises overnight. Or we can just mark a piece of tape and stick it to the jar and track it that way as well. Good morning, it's day 6, and the reason I didn't show you yesterday is, well, today and yesterday are exactly the same as day 4. We're going to continue feeding it twice during the day. We're just going to take out almost all of the starter, leaving about 25 grams or a tablespoon, and then feed it as before. Now, yesterday the starter was looking really healthy. There was lots and lots of fermentation. It smelled really good. So let's check on how it's doing today. So we can see that the starter is really nice and active. It's super bubbly. You can see it on the side. You can also see that it's definitely more than doubled in size. Let's give it a smell. It smells really nice and fresh, almost fruity. There's none of that really bad odor we had right at the start. This is really good. It's almost ready for baking. What I'm going to say is we don't necessarily want to bake with it straight away. We want to let it stabilize a little bit longer. So I'm going to let it go the full 7 days at least before we give it a go. But this is a really good sign. So now it's just back to our regularly scheduled feeding program. It's our final day, it's day 7, which means one thing. We should now have a starter that is rising and falling regularly with every feed, and is nice and healthy so we can get baking with it. So we're going to do 2 more feeds as normal today, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how to store and care your starter if you're not going to bake with it very regularly, maybe once a week, and you don't want to feed it every single day. Okay, feed done, let's talk about starter maintenance. So, now that the starter is nice and active and it's nice and healthy, I'd suggest keep feeding it for a few days just to make sure it really is properly active, properly healthy, and you've really cultivated all that bacteria and that yeast, so you've got a really healthy starter. But I know the reality is that most people aren't going to bake with this every day. I don't bake with mine every day. I bake with mine once a week normally. So we don't want to waste a lot of flour by feeding it constantly. So the best thing, or the thing that I prefer, is keeping the starter in the fridge and then feeding it when we need it. Now, in reality, what that actually means is using the coldness of the fridge, the temperature of the fridge, to slow down the fermentation. So in here, I have my regular starter, the one that I use to make my bread that I've been using for a while, and not the one we've just made. And this one, you can see, there's no bubbles to it really. It's just, it looks like flour and water, but this is still nice and alive. What's happened is the cold temperature of the fridge slows down the fermentation, but keeps it alive without needing regular feeding, which means we're not using as much waste. So obviously I can't use this to bake right now because it's in a kind of incubation stage. So what you need to do is revive it, bring it back to life, and you just do that by feeding. Now for me personally, what I like to do is feed it at least 2 times before I use it, and that just makes sure it's properly active and it gives it a really good flavour. So what I like to do is, say I'm going to bake on a Saturday morning, a 1-day bake, so I'll have the loaves in the fridge Saturday night so I can bake on Sunday. What I'll do is I'll take it out Friday morning, first thing, give it a feed, and then in the evening before I go to bed I'll give it a second feed, and that means by the morning on Saturday when I'm wanting to bake, it's perfectly ready to go. So the other thing to talk about is how to keep your starter healthy when you go away for more than a week, say 2 weeks on holiday. And actually it's not as a worrisome issue as you might think. So many people think they kill their starters all the time. I used to think I was killing my starter all the time. And there's a couple of things that can happen. So when you go away and you leave the starter in the fridge for a long time, you can get this layer of hooch, this kind of like alcohol layer on top. And people think, oh no, it's dead, I've killed it, something's happened. In reality, all you have to do is pour that off, feed it a couple of times, and the starter will be back to health. They're really sturdy, hardy things. They're very, very hard to actually kill. So now we have a starter that is really healthy, it's rising and falling every time we feed it, it's nice and active, it smells great, we're ready to bake some bread. But before we get to that, next week's video, the second part in this series, is going to be a visit to a bakery to get some professional advice on how to form the loaves, how to prove it, and then also to answer all the sourdough questions you sent me on Instagram. So what I'm going to suggest, so we can all do this together at the same time, is once you watch that video next Thursday, make sure that you then start your sourdough, so that when the video the week after comes out, which will be my go-to sourdough recipe, we can all bake our first loaves of bread together. Oh, and this bread, the one that I showed you at the start of the video, well, I made this from the starter that I've just shown you how to make. So hopefully now that you have a really nice active starter, you'll be able to make breads just like this.